Hi, welcome to Revenue Marketing Television. I am your host, Jeff Pedowitz, President and CEO of the Pedowitz Group. Today on the CMO Insight Series, we have Armen Najarian, who is Chief Marketing Officer of ThreatMetrix. Armen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Appreciate it.
You bet. So we were just talking a little bit before we started the recording. So a lot of transformation going on over the last 2 years at ThreatMetrix. Could you give us a few highlights?
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. It'll be 2 years for me in August, and in many ways, it was an overhaul of all components of the marketing mix here at ThreatMetrix. On the brand side, we're engaged in a fairly long-term strategic relook at the brand, and we'll be unveiling sort of a rolling thunder new brand of ThreatMetrix over the course of the next few months, and so more to follow on that. On the demand gen side of the house, it's been just as in-depth, and we have a lot to point to. New team, new tools, new processes, new campaign strategies. It's been a big change across the board.
So what's been I guess the biggest challenge for you over the last couple of years?
So I'd say there's been a personal challenge, and I'd say more of a corporate challenge. The personal challenge is this is a space that we are in the cybersecurity space, generally speaking, here at ThreatMetrix. And while I've been in the world of B2B marketing virtually all of my career, I never really spent meaningful time in the cyberspace. And so coming up to speed on the industry and the terminology and the competitive set, was a steep hill to climb up for the first 6 months. So that was, getting up that hill, at least most of the way, was a big opportunity for me to really lean into this role. And I'd say at a corporate level, we're in a fast-growing industry, fast-growing company. The company year over year is growing at least 60%. We're becoming a bigger company. And so scaling this operation, and making some of these large-scale transformations while operating the business and not losing a step has been sort of a fun challenge to have at the corporate level.
So you've been running marketing for a while now, not just at ThreatMetrix, but other places. Do you find marketing's changing? Is it becoming more like a business to run?
It really is. And when I reflect on my own role and how I go about my day-to-day role, I actually don't even think of myself as a marketer. I think of myself as a business person first, who happens to do marketing. And I think that sort of mental shift really helps guide me in the conversations that I have, the breadth of knowledge that I must absorb, and who I interact with on a day-to-day basis. I think one good example is, my partner in crime here at ThreatMetrix is surprisingly the CFO. I spend a lot of time with the CFO. And, he and I work together on thinking through, I would say, investment allocations to, how we go about really thinking through the metrics and reporting out on those metrics internally and to the board. That's just been one example of sort of this business person focused approach that I've taken to this role.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. I know for a lot of marketing executives, they can find finance a little intimidating. So how did you get over that hump? Have you been working with finance for a while in your career?
So I actually studied accounting as an undergrad. So in some ways, okay. The language is somewhat familiar to me. I never worked a day as an accountant. I became an entrepreneur out of college, but I guess that training in college has had its effect on me.
Awesome. So how have the people that you are hiring changing? What are the skills that you're looking for today? How are the team dynamics changing in 2017?
Yeah, so I've rebuilt the entire team. Just to give you a little bit of context, I have a worldwide organization of 21 people. Within those 21 is the BDR function, the business development rep function. If you leave the BDR team aside, there's about 15 folks around the world. I think the number one thing that I'm looking for, there's certainly skills we need and some technical skills we need, but that aside, it really comes down to leadership and fit. And those are the first two things I really look for. There needs to be, for certain demand gen functions, a base level of proficiency with some of the tools that we work with. But if someone doesn't fit in the team or can't demonstrate leadership potential, it's going to be really hard to make a difference here at ThreatMetrix.
So how are you managing change? Because it sounds like you guys are going through a lot, both with your system growth, your revenue growth, as well as the changes that you're making to the organization.
So managing change, I'd say at a personal level, in hiring really good leaders, it gives me the opportunity to delegate and to allow the business to operate. And that's been a really nice transition for me personally and for the company, so that I can focus on working with my peers across the business, working with my boss, the CEO, and getting out into the industry. So I'd say that's been one way to do it. I'd say the other way is, in retooling the overall operations and rebuilding the dashboard for marketing at ThreatMetrix, is having a set of metrics that we look at on a weekly basis. So there are 5 metrics my team comes back to me with every Friday night that I report out onto the management team every Monday morning. And these synthesize, I would say, the different levers that we're pulling across the marketing mix. And so having this sort of analytical view that can be succinct and that I can communicate to the management team or even to the board has been very helpful for me.
So just 5 numbers, what are they?
Let's see, I knew you were going to ask me that question. So we have 2 share of voice metrics, one for our corporate communications, and basically our PR share of voice, one for our social media. We have new logo coverage. So we look at new logo pipeline coverage to revenue. We're currently pegged out at 4 times coverage. Okay. So we look at new logo coverage for both our core direct business as well as coverage for our channel program. So that's 4 metrics right there. And let's see, the 5th metric. I knew you were going to quiz me. I'll remember that in a few minutes and come back to you, Jeff. My mind has slipped me.
No worries. I wrote it down on a Post-it for you earlier, but no, it's okay. So your views on MarTech, too much, just right, need more? What's your take?
There's definitely a lot of technology, that famous or infamous landscape chart that keeps getting more and more condensed every year. I've actually used that chart in internal sales kickoffs when just talking about positioning ThreatMetrix in a competitive space. I can't imagine being in the MarTech space and trying to position myself. As a consumer of technology, yes, there are a lot of choices, and we're a Salesforce Marketo shop at our core. But for example, we put a stake in the ground a year ago and said, okay, we believe in this account-based marketing model, and we're gonna retool ourselves around that discipline. We actually met with the Engagio team very early on, and actually in late 2015 when they were just getting started in San Mateo, and onboarded the Engagio tool late last year. So it's just an example of really pushing the limits and moving away from a comfort zone around MQLs into this new world of marketing qualified accounts, retraining my team and the management team around a newer set of metrics.
That's great. So what's your approach to the customer lifecycle? How much, because you talked in your metrics about coverage and share of voice, but how much of your effort is geared towards top of funnel, bringing in new logos versus lifecycle marketing, cross-sell, upsell, retention, loyalty?
Yep. So in the campaign investment allocation, worldwide for 2017, about 2/3 of my campaign dollars, program dollars, are going to new logo acquisition, and about 1/3 are going into install-based marketing. And that's a dramatic shift from years past. One of the opportunities when I joined this business was to actually have a dedicated install base campaign program, and so now about 1/3 of those dollars flow in there, and then building very specific programs around that. So for our new logo work, where we're continuing to invest heavily, it's a worldwide program. We go to market by industry. We build content by industry, and instrument the buyer journey. We typically have 4 personas within a given industry that we speak to. And we do our best to map content assets along that journey for each of those roles. And the install base, we don't look at it by industry. You look at it by what's your starting point from a product perspective, and where do we see the white space. And so it's obviously a different strategy, a different set of personas in some cases, and a different set of assets. So it's it's created a lot of work from a worldwide planning perspective, but we're already starting to see the benefits of this very focused campaign strategy, bifurcated campaign strategy.
That's great. So what are some of the early wins that you're seeing?
So we launched a new vertical industry campaign into the insurance sector, where historically we haven't really done a whole lot of work. We've primarily been very successful in the banking sector and the merchant, the e-commerce sector, and payments. So those sort of three spaces we've historically done a lot of work. We knew that the insurance space was a close cousin of the financial services space and sector. But a slightly different value proposition, different messaging, certainly different assets. And so we launched a dedicated campaign just about a month and a half ago, worldwide campaign. We just closed our first big account, Progressive Insurance.
Already, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and in all fairness, that conversation had been taking place for several months before we launched the campaign. We certainly were able to touch that account through our campaign and ongoing communications. But we have a pipeline now, so we're shooting, obviously for that 4x coverage for our desired revenue in this particular campaign, and we're progressing along nicely there with some really good marquee logos within that sector. On the install base side, we just launched our very first dedicated campaign, and that's all around a mobile SDK that we sell here at ThreatMetrix, and we have a very big install base footprint that either knew nothing about the mobile SDK or hadn't implemented it. And it's free to implement. And once it's implemented is when the revenue flows for ThreatMetrix. So just putting our campaign around that, we had our first implementation directly tied to the campaign taking place right now. And we got a pretty good pipeline behind that of very valid prospects.
It's great. So from a process perspective, it sounds like you've put in some processes around account-based marketing, processes around the install base, processes around new verticals. What are some of the other things that you've been working on to scale the business?
Yep. So I'd say, communication, with my team and across the team has certainly been a big part of it. How I communicate to my boss, to the executive team, to the board. We happen to have a board meeting today, so the metrics that I use there have evolved over time. This will be the first board meeting where I introduce some of the ABM metrics that I've been talking about for a long time. And they'll see now this start to be reflected in the dashboard. I think other types of communications, sort of the reach and frequency of internal communications, have been really, really important, just to align the troops, the general sales team at our sales kickoffs earlier this year, just really hammering home the strategies that we have in place and how we allocate investments, by industry, by region, by install base versus new, right? Really explaining that rationale internally to the stakeholders has helped people understand. So one example is, North America, where we're very strong historically, but isn't really the big growth area for us, right? We're still growing in North America, but the big growth is in Europe and Asia. And so, by explaining the strategy to my head of North America sales, it became a much easier conversation to say, hey, I'm actually investing disproportionately higher in Europe and Asia for marketing programs and disproportionately lower in your region, but I think we'll be okay. And we didn't have a whole lot of debate about that. He understood, given the strategy and the metrics that we have in place, sort of the rationale and the way that we can monitor that. So it's just an example of how communication has helped make this transition and scaling this business a lot smoother.
Oh, that's great. So in closing, what advice would you give to your fellow marketing executive on approaching transformation?
Yeah, so I would say, study the space. You take the time to really understand, what you want to transform. There's a lot you can bite off. If you look across the three generic pillars of people, process, technology, it all matters for sure. And so you can try to attack little bits of it at a time, or move sequentially. Having a core team, I would say, is foundational. That's where I happen to start in rebuilding the team. And, thinking about different technologies. I had mentioned just a couple of the technologies that we use. There's definitely a sea change taking place in the B2B marketing sector where, the legacy Marketo metrics are still good and they're not going away, but, augmenting that with just some newer ways to look at the business through an account lens, really, really important. I would say really think about how that affects your business. And then this process around communication, within your team, across the company, up to the board, just super important that you've got crisp, dependable and consistent communication styles.
Great. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Armen. Great insight, and it's easy to see why you're having so much success. So thank you for being on the show today.
Appreciate it, Jeff. Thanks very much for having me. Take care.
You bet.